When a man reaches 60, he doesn't expect to find himself standing on the curb with nothing but a duffel bag and a couple of photo albums, watching his life get tossed into a dumpster like yesterday's scraps. But that's exactly where I was on that cold Tuesday morning. My daughter-in-law had been the ringleader, though my son had stood behind her with crossed arms, silent and complicit. "You can't stay here anymore," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need our space. You're just in the way." I looked at my son, hoping for a flicker of compassion, a trace of the boy I'd raised. Instead, he looked away, jaw tight. Not a single word of protest as my belongings, my clothes, my books, even my late wife's keepsakes, were thrown into black trash bags and hurled onto the lawn. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Some shook their heads in pity, others in quiet judgment. Me? I stood there, spine straight, eyes fixed on the people I had once called family. The humiliation burned, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me beg. I gathered what I could and walked away. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from the weight of my bag but from the crushing realization, I had given everything to my son, my money, my time, my years, and this was my reward. That night, I slept on a bench near the bus station, the bitter air gnawing at my bones. Strangers passed without a glance. I told myself I'd figure something out in the morning, that this was temporary. But deep inside, a darker fire had already been lit. They thought I was powerless. They thought they could discard me like garbage. What they didn't know was that I still had a secret, one that would turn their smug little world upside down in just 3 days. Because revenge, like hunger, sharpens when you've been starved. The first night on that bench taught me how quickly pride can freeze in your chest when the wind cuts through your coat. By dawn, my hands were stiff, my stomach hollow, but my mind had never been sharper. They wanted me broken. They wanted me crawling back, humiliated. Instead, I sat there and counted hours like coins, every tick of the clock adding interest to the debt they owed me. On the second day, I found shelter in a diner downtown. The waitress, a kind woman with silver streaks in her hair, poured me coffee without asking too many questions. She must have seen the exhaustion in my eyes. I spent that day hunched in a corner booth, scribbling on napkins with a borrowed pen, mapping out steps. I wasn't planning survival, I was planning reckoning. See, my son and his wife believed the house was theirs now, clean and free of the old man's shadow. But the deed? The deed was still in my name. They hadn't thought about that when they tossed my belongings into the trash. And the accounts they assumed were empty. They had no clue about the safety deposit box I'd kept quiet for decades, where documents thicker than any wallet waited for me to make my move. By the third day, my body ached, but my spirit had hardened into something cold and deliberate. I walked past their house once, unseen, just to look. Through the curtains I caught a glimpse of them laughing in the kitchen, my son pouring wine, his wife clinking her glass. My photographs were gone from the shelves, replaced with her trinkets. My chair by the window, empty, as if I had never existed. I clenched my fists, the anger burning away the cold. Let them laugh. Let them celebrate their victory. They didn't know they'd only won a battle. The war hadn't even started yet. 3 days. That's all it took for me to stop being a victim and start being a man with a plan. And when I came back, I wouldn't be asking for my seat at the table. I'd be taking the whole damn table away from them. I had one advantage they never suspected, I kept things the old way, paper, ink, and the stubborn habit of making copies. While they were tossing my shirts into black bags, I had been careful for years to tuck the important things in places a screamer or a lazy hand wouldn't glance, a folded deed inside the false bottom of a toolbox, photocopies of account summaries in the lining of an old coat, and a single key that mattered more than any of the jewelry they threw away. That key fit a safety deposit box at the bank 2 blocks from the station where I'd slept the first night. On the morning of the third day, I walked into that bank like a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The marble floor was cool under my shoes. The teller greeted me with the same bland smile she gave every morning. People were quick to make assumptions, and she assumed I was just another retired man paying a bill. I handed her my identification and the box number scratched on the inside of my palm, as if it were some small secret between old friends. The security door hummed behind me. The box was heavy with the scent of metal and paper. Inside, the envelope I'd kept there for decades lay snug and patient. I set it on the counter and felt something settle in my chest, a pressure that was not fear but a long, slow readiness. The envelope contained the original deed to the house, long-neglected stock certificates, and a list, my list, of accounts and numbers that added up to more than they ever imagined. I had always believed in leaving things organized. You never know when you'll need to show your hand. I didn't go back to the house that day. I walked 2 blocks to a bench and called a lawyer I'd used in the past, the sort of man who understood trusts and the nasty grammar of property law. His voice on the other end was a low, professional rumble. I told him the facts plainly. I'd been unlawfully evicted from my own home, my belongings thrown out, and I wanted immediate legal advice. He asked questions, names, times, witnesses, and I answered with the kind of precision that comes from rehearsing outrage into a dossier. By late afternoon, I had instructions and a file stamped in my hand. We would not rush to court for a melodramatic confrontation, that would please them. The law, when properly wielded, is a scalpel. My lawyer set out a quiet plan: file an emergency motion to restore possession, serve notice to my son and his wife, and begin a record trail that would show their actions as what they were: intentional, knowing, and illegal. He also suggested a temporary restraining order to keep anyone from selling, moving, or destroying property while the matter was decided. It was surgical, and it carried the scent of inevitability. That night I sat in a cheap motel, the fluorescent bulb buzzing above the small desk where I drafted the affidavit. Every line I wrote felt like laying track for a train I intended to run straight through their arrogance. I described exactly what had happened on the lawn, named neighbors who'd seen the bags thrown, and attached a photo or two I'd managed to salvage on my phone. When I slipped the folder into the envelope and sealed it, the humiliation I'd felt 3 days earlier had been transmuted into something colder and more dangerous. They believed I was helpless because they had seen me carried out like a trunk. They had not seen the man who, in a diner on day 2, had mapped the legalese in the margins of a napkin. They had not seen me open the safety deposit box, or phone the lawyer, or write the affidavit. In their minds I was garbage left on a curb. In truth, I had the deed, the numbers, the law on a leash, and 3 days enough to make a man sharp. By the morning of the 4th day, my lawyer had filed the motion. The ink was barely dry before a process server was on his way to my son's house with a thick envelope. I didn't go myself. I wanted the papers to speak louder than my presence ever could. At noon, the server called me. "Delivered," he said simply. She slammed the door in my face, but he read the cover page before she yanked it away. "Trust me, they know what this is." I could almost see it, my daughter-in-law's smug smile vanishing, my son's brow furrowed as he stumbled through legal language that made one thing clear: they were being ordered to appear before a judge, and until then, they had no authority over the property they'd claimed as their own. Later that evening, a neighbor, old Mrs. Kent, called me. She whispered like she was sharing gossip too sweet to keep. "Your boy's wife was on the porch yelling. She said something about you being a liar, about losing everything. Half the street heard her. Then she went back inside and slammed the door so hard the shutters rattled." I thanked her politely and hung up, a thin smile tugging at my lips. The seed of panic had been planted. They thought they'd buried me under humiliation. Now they were realizing they'd only covered the roots of something that had been growing quietly all along. That night, as I sat in the motel room, I thought about what I would say when I finally saw them in court. Part of me wanted to rage, to spill every ounce of betrayal and anger in front of the judge. But another part of me knew the truth: calm words cut deeper when the other side is screaming. I imagined my son standing there, red-faced, his wife seething, both forced to confront the fact that the house wasn't theirs, the money wasn't theirs, and the man they called useless was now holding the reins. I poured myself a glass of water from the motel tap and raised it in a mock toast to the empty room. "Enjoy the silence while you can," I murmured. "Because soon, it's your turn to explain." The knock on their door had been only the beginning. The courthouse smelled of dust and polish, like old paper that refused to forget. I arrived early, wearing my best suit, the same one I had worn to my wife's funeral years ago. It was a little tighter around the waist, but it gave me the dignity I wanted. I wasn't walking in there as a beggar pleading for scraps. I was walking in as the rightful owner, the man who had been wronged. When my son and his wife walked through the doors, the change in them was obvious. She still tried to carry that smug confidence, chin high, but her eyes darted nervously around the room. My son couldn't even look at me. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and sat down stiffly, like a schoolboy waiting for a scolding. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. My lawyer spoke first, laying out the facts with a surgeon's precision: the deed in my name, the unlawful eviction, the destruction of property. He even held up photos of the trash bags piled on the curb, witnesses' statements from neighbors, and the motion for emergency possession. When it was their turn, my daughter-in-law did the talking. She tried to spin a story about me being unstable, about how they had no choice but to remove me for my own safety. Her voice cracked once or twice, and the judge raised an eyebrow at her theatrics. My son sat beside her, nodding weakly, barely adding a word. Then came my turn. I stood, hands steady on the table, and looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice low but clear, "I worked 40 years to buy and maintain that home. Every nail in those walls, every brick in the foundation, I paid for with sweat on my back. And 3 days ago, they decided I was nothing more than clutter. They threw me out like garbage. But as you can see, I am the legal owner of that property, and I am here to reclaim what is mine." Silence hung heavy in the room. Even the court stenographer paused for a heartbeat before her keys clicked again. The judge shuffled some papers, then looked at my son and his wife. "You had no legal right to evict this man from his own home," he said sternly. "This court orders immediate restoration of possession to the plaintiff. You are to vacate the premises within 72 hours. Failure to do so will result in forcible removal by the sheriff's office." My daughter-in-law's face drained of color. My son's shoulders slumped, his head dropping into his hands. I didn't smile, didn't gloat. I simply nodded, thanked the judge, and sat back down. The hammer had fallen. Justice had spoken. And this was only the beginning of their downfall. The drive back to the house felt longer than usual, though maybe it was just the weight of victory pressing on my chest. My lawyer rode with me, flipping through his notes, already talking about next steps. But I barely heard him. All I could think about was walking through that front door again, not as an outcast, but as the rightful owner. When we pulled up, my son and his wife were already outside. Boxes cluttered the porch, and I could see them moving hurriedly back and forth. She was barking orders, her voice shrill and panicked. My son looked pale, dragging his feet like a man heading to his own execution. "Dad," he started when he saw me. His tone was soft, almost pleading. "Can we talk about this?" I stepped out of the car slowly, savoring the moment. "There's nothing left to talk about." The judge made it clear. "You have 72 hours. Use them wisely." Her face twisted in anger. "You can't just throw us out like this. We've built a life here." I met her glare with a calm steadiness that seemed to rattle her more than shouting would have. "Funny. That's exactly what you did to me. Only difference is, the law agrees with me." They kept packing, though every slammed door and muttered curse was aimed squarely at me. I didn't care. With each box carried out, with each picture frame pulled from the wall, the house slowly shed their presence. Neighbors began to gather, some pretending to check mail or sweep their porches, others openly watching. Whispers carried down the street, "That's the man they kicked out, he's back." I stood straighter, letting the humiliation of 3 days ago dissolve under their eyes. I was no longer the old man on the curb, I was the homeowner reclaiming what was his. By the end of the first day, their car was stuffed with bags, and her shrill voice had turned into sharp silence. My son wouldn't meet my eyes. I almost pitied him, but then I remembered the way he had looked away while she ordered my life into the trash. That pity hardened into stone. On the second day, I walked through the house while they were gone, inspecting the damage. They had stripped some rooms bare, taken furniture that wasn't theirs, even dented a wall trying to haul out a cabinet. I took photos of everything. Every nail hole, every scrape, every missing piece would be documented. They would pay for that too. By the morning of the third day, the house was mine again, quiet, empty, still. I carried in a few belongings I'd managed to save, setting my photo albums back on the shelf where they belonged. And when the 72 hours were up, I locked the door behind me, the keys cool and solid in my hand. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was proof that I hadn't been discarded. It was the first stone in the wall of their ruin. Taking the house back was only half the battle. They thought I had no fight left in me, just a roof to sleep under and a bed to collapse into. But I wasn't finished. Not yet. The morning after I locked that front door, I went straight to the bank with my lawyer. We sat in a quiet office with a young branch manager who looked like he still had milk on his breath. My lawyer slid the folder across the desk. Inside were account numbers, property records, and the trust documents I'd kept hidden for decades. The manager skimmed the papers, eyes widening as he realized just how much sat under my name. "Mr. Hayes, I didn't realize." "Exactly," I interrupted. "No one did. And I'd like to make some adjustments." Within hours, we had frozen the joint accounts my son had tried to worm into years earlier. He thought I'd forgotten about that little attempt, his request for me to add him as a backup, in case something happened. Well, something had happened. I'd seen his true character. And now he was locked out for good. We also moved the bulk of my liquid assets into a trust earmarked for my grandchildren, his children. They were innocent in all this, and I wouldn't let their parents' greed rob them of a future. The trust meant that when they turned 18, they'd have a chance at college, a business, or whatever dream they chose. It also meant their parents would never touch a cent. As we finalized the signatures, my lawyer leaned back with a satisfied grin. "You understand, sir, once this is filed, there's no undoing it. Not without your say-so." I met his eyes. "That's the point." By the time I left the bank, the sun was setting, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and red. I walked a little taller that evening. They had stripped me of dignity once, tossing my life into garbage bags. But now, I'd stripped them of something far more valuable, control. The reckoning wasn't loud. There were no shouting matches in the street, no fists thrown. Just a quiet rearrangement of paper and power that left them outside looking in. And the best part? They didn't even know yet. Not until the notices arrived in their mailbox would they realize the full measure of what I'd done. And when they did, their laughter would be replaced with the silence of people who finally understood they'd lost everything. 2 weeks later, the storm finally hit. I didn't see it myself, I heard it from the neighbor across the street, the same one who had watched them drag my things to the curb. He called me, barely able to contain his chuckle. "They got something in the mail today," he said. "Big envelope, official looking." She tore it open right there on the porch. Next thing you know, she's screaming like a banshee. "Your son just stood there, white as a sheet." I already knew what it was. The bank and the lawyer had mailed the official confirmation of the trust changes, the freezes, the notices of exclusion. Everything was stamped, sealed, and legally ironclad. Their names were nowhere to be found. Not on the house. Not on the accounts. Not on the future. That evening, my phone rang. My son's number flashed on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, savoring the silence. But then I answered. "Dad," he said, his voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? You can't just cut us out. We're family." Family. The word nearly made me laugh. Family doesn't dump you on the curb like an old mattress. Family doesn't toss your wife's photo albums into the trash. You made your choice, I said coldly. And now I've made mine. His wife grabbed the phone then, her voice shrill and venomous. "You're ruining us. Do you hear me? Ruining us. You'll regret this." I let her finish her tirade, every word digging her hole deeper. When she finally stopped for air, I spoke slowly, deliberately. "The only thing I regret," I said, "is ever letting you under my roof." Then I hung up. I leaned back in my chair, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a cloak. It wasn't triumph I felt, not yet. It was something colder, steadier. Justice settling into place. They thought I would beg to come back. Instead, they were the ones begging now. And this was only the beginning of the life they had chosen for themselves. The notice wasn't just paper. It was a mirror. And what they saw in it was the reflection of their own betrayal. 3 months passed. By then, the house no longer smelled of their perfume or cologne. The air was clean again, carrying only the faint scent of polish from the wood floors I'd scrubbed myself. The walls, once cluttered with their cheap decorations, were bare. I hung my wife's photographs back where they belonged, her smile restored to the corners of every room. Neighbors came by sometimes, curious. They'd linger at the gate, offering small talk that carried a subtle undercurrent of approval. They had watched the spectacle unfold, my eviction, the court, the sheriff's visit. Now they saw me, steady and unbroken, walking out each morning with my head high. Respect, once buried under whispers of pity, had returned. But the silence in the house wasn't just peaceful. It was powerful. Every creak of the floorboards reminded me of the nights I had been left outside, treated like a stray dog. Every time I set a cup down on the kitchen table, I remembered how they had laughed in that same spot after throwing my belongings into the trash. That memory didn't hurt anymore. It fueled me. My lawyer called one afternoon to confirm what I already knew: their appeal had been denied. The judge's ruling stood firm. The property was mine beyond question, and the trusts were untouchable. My son and his wife had no leverage, no claim, no path back. And yet, I still saw him sometimes. Not in person, he didn't dare come by, but in the corner of the diner where I ate breakfast. Someone would whisper, "Saw your boy at the gas station, looking rough. Car's gone. Place they rented kicked them out. Things don't look good." I'd nod politely, hiding the conflict twisting inside me. He was my blood. But he was also the man who had stood silent while his wife threw me to the curb. That evening, as I sat in my armchair, the house quiet except for the ticking clock, I thought of him. The anger was still there, but alongside it was something else, something heavier. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the awareness that my revenge had cut deeper than even I imagined. They had lost the house, the money, the respect of the community. They had lost everything. And all I had done was hold them to the consequences of their own choices. The house was empty, yes. But it was also whole again. Mine. And tomorrow, I would decide whether to leave it at that, or to twist the knife one final time. Winter crept in, frosting the windows of the house I had fought to reclaim. The rooms were warm again, lit with the steady glow of lamps, but the silence was heavier than before. I had my home, my dignity, and my legacy intact. Yet there was one piece left unfinished, an ending that needed to be spoken, not just lived. I decided to write a letter. Not a rant, not a plea, just the truth laid bare, sharp as glass. I wrote to my son first. You stood by while your wife dragged my life into the street. You let her sneer at the man who built the roof over your head. You could have stopped her with one word. You didn't. I was your father, and you chose silence. Remember that when your children ask you why they don't live here anymore. Then I addressed her. You thought you won when you locked that door behind me. But doors have keys, and keys have owners. The law has spoken, and so have I. You are nothing more than a guest who overstayed her welcome, and the house has spat you out. At the bottom of the letter, I added one final line for them both: I am not useless. I am the man who reminded you what consequences look like. I sealed the envelope and mailed it, knowing full well the effect it would have. Not rage, that would fade. Not arguments, they'd exhaust themselves with those. No, it would leave behind silence, the kind that presses down on the chest when you realize the fight is over and you've lost. Weeks passed. I never heard back. But word drifted through the neighborhood: they'd left town. Moved into a cramped apartment 2 cities over. The shine had gone from their faces, and people who once thought of them as successful now spoke in hushed tones about arrogance and downfall. And me? I stayed. Each morning, I brewed coffee in the kitchen where I once stood humiliated. I sat in the armchair they had called bold and useless, and felt the strength of having endured. My wife's photos smiled down on me, her eyes soft with approval. Revenge isn't about rage. It's about balance. And balance had been restored. The house was mine. My legacy was secure. And the last word, carved into the silence they left behind, was mine too. They kicked me out and threw my belongings in the trash. But after 3 days, I remembered who I was. And they'll never forget it.